Lofty ideals can fall into profound states of disrepair, especially when confronted with the dynamics of power. Lofty ideals can begin to shift and shimmy until little of their original substance remains. Over its 2,500-year history, Buddhism has not been immune to this phenomenon. While Buddhism strives to eradicate human suffering, at times it has contributed to the exact opposite. In this episode, we'll take a look at the dynamics that contributed to Zen Buddhism's support of Japanese aggression during World War II. Welcome to the Undead Sages podcast, where we travel back in time to talk to long-dead wise men and women. Of special interest is the question how sensitive people can live rich and meaningful lives in our uncertain times. My name is Merijn de Haen, and today we'll once again be talking to the Buddha. First, some facts. From the 1890s onward, Japan began behaving aggressively. It attacked China, annexed Taiwan, defeated Russia, and took over the Korean peninsula. After annexing Korea, Japan invaded ever greater portions of Chinese territory, before attacking the United States and taking over much of the Indo-Pacific. These military campaigns led to the death of an estimated 14 to 30 million people, most of them Chinese. In addition, the defeat of Japan by Allied forces caused another 2.5 to 3 million Japanese to perish. Throughout it all, Japanese Buddhist institutions played a significant role of support and legitimation of Japanese imperial expansion. We've been talking to the Buddha for a few weeks now. Let's get the Buddha's views on this sad phenomenon. Knowing him, he'll surprise us with a clear-eyed and profoundly human examination of the situation. Welcome, Buddha.
Thank you, Merijn.
Just to recap, we've traveled back in time 2,500 years, near the time of your death. It's the rainy season, and the community of monks, the Sangha, is on its yearly rains retreat. We've talked a total of 6 times in the past weeks. We discussed your teachings, your place in time, and the development of your message over the centuries, millennia even, up to the present day. Today, I'd like to probe a topic that is less appetizing, but nevertheless needs to be looked at carefully. The topic of when the Dharma is applied wrongly. The instance I'd like to talk with you about today is one that involves the Sangha's support for a lengthy campaign of imperial expansion. At the cost of over 15 million lives, the Japanese wars of conquest in the early 20th century. Tell me, Buddha, how do you look at this period?
The support that some members of the Buddhist Sangha gave to Imperial Japan's military campaigns is deeply troubling. Buddhism teaches non-violence, compassion, and wisdom, yet during the early 20th century, many Zen and other Buddhist leaders in Japan justified war, militarism, and conquest. This contradiction between Dhamma and nationalism is a painful reminder of how even spiritual traditions can be misused when people become attached to power, identity, or ideology.
Zen is often associated with peace and mindfulness. How did it come to support Japanese militarism?
It is a complex story tied to history, nationalism, and the way Zen was interpreted in Japan. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Japan underwent rapid modernization and sought to become a major world power. Buddhism, including Zen, adapted to fit the nationalistic ideals of the time. Many Zen leaders aligned themselves with the state, seeing it as their duty to support Japan's expansion and military efforts.
This is interesting. Can you say more? Why did Japan undergo rapid modernization?
The period of the Meiji Restoration was all about making Japan strong and independent. Before that, Japan had been isolated for over 200 years under the Tokugawa shogunate. But by the mid 19th century, Western powers were expanding into Asia, and Japan saw what happened to China: the Opium Wars, colonization, and humiliation at the hands of European powers. Japan's leaders feared the same fate, so they decided to modernize rapidly to compete with the West. Nationalism became the driving force behind this modernization. The idea was simple: a unified, strong Japan could resist Western domination. To achieve this, the government needed to centralize power, create a strong military, and build a shared national identity.
So the Japanese had a choice to be either another prey for the predators to devour or become a predator itself.
Yes, that's the choice Japanese leaders saw at any rate. To that end, the Japanese forged a strong nationalist ideology, adopted many Western institutions, and also made a living god out of their emperor.
What role did the emperor play in this nationalism?
The emperor became the symbol of Japan's unity. Before the Meiji era, the emperor had little real power. The shoguns ruled the country. But the new government restored the emperor as the ultimate authority, using him as a unifying figure. They presented him as divine, descended from the Shinto sun goddess Amaterasu. This gave nationalism a religious dimension. Loyalty to Japan became loyalty to the emperor, which was almost like a sacred duty. This ideology, known as kokutai, or national essence, helped rally people around the idea of a strong, centralized nation.
How did this affect religion in Japan?
Buddhism had been powerful under the shoguns, but the Meiji government saw it as a threat because it was tied to the old feudal system and had strong connections to China. Instead, the government promoted Shinto as the state religion. Shinto, being native to Japan, was seen as purer and more aligned with nationalism. The state established State Shinto, a version of Shinto that emphasized emperor worship and national identity. Shrines became government institutions, and Shinto priests were treated like civil servants. Buddhism, on the other hand, was attacked. There was a movement called Haibutsu Kishaku, which means something like abolish Buddhism, destroy Shakyamuni. Thousands of Buddhist temples were closed or destroyed, monks were forced to return to lay life, and Buddhist influence in politics and education was severely reduced.
So Buddhism had to adapt to survive?
Exactly. To avoid being wiped out, many Buddhist leaders aligned themselves with the new nationalist ideology. They emphasized Buddhism's usefulness to the state, promoted loyalty to the emperor, and even reinterpreted Buddhist teachings to support Japan's militarization. By the early 20th century, this adaptation had gone so far that many Buddhist institutions actively supported Japan's wars, seeing them as part of Japan's divine mission.
So nationalism, modernization, and state religion all became linked?
Yes. Nationalism wasn't just about politics, it became a total system of thought, combining military strength, emperor worship, and religious unity. The goal was to make Japan a major world power, capable of standing against the West. This ideology eventually led Japan down the path of imperial expansion, militarism, and ultimately World War II.
But this is still somewhat strange to me. Help me understand. Isn't one of the core Buddhist precepts to refrain from doing harm? Buddhism everywhere is basically against violence, right?
Yes. My teachings emphasize ahimsa, non-violence. However, Zen, particularly in Japan, took on a different approach. Some Zen masters argued that enlightenment transcended concepts of good and evil, including war and peace. They taught that a warrior could fight without attachment, acting in a state of pure awareness. This interpretation was used to justify violence as part of a higher purpose.
When did this connection between Zen and the military begin?
The roots go way back to the beginning of the samurai era. During the medieval period, Zen became popular among samurai, who saw its emphasis on discipline, meditation, and direct experience as useful for their warrior code, Bushido. Zen practice helped them face hardship, combat, even death without fear. By the late 19th century, during the Meiji Restoration, Japan was modernizing rapidly and re emphasizing its warrior heritage. The state promoted Bushido as part of national identity, and Zen played a role in shaping this ideology.
Was this purely for survival, or did monks actually believe in nationalism?
Both. At first, many Buddhist leaders went along with nationalism out of necessity, but over time, some genuinely embraced it. Many Buddhist monks encouraged the idea that self sacrifice for Japan was a spiritual duty. In some cases, monks even reinterpreted Buddhist teachings to fit nationalist goals. For example, impermanence was used to suggest that soldiers should not fear death. The body is impermanent anyway. Non attachment was framed as a reason to let go of personal concerns and serve the emperor. Karma was used to suggest that Japan's military victories were part of a just cosmic order. By the early 20th century, Buddhism had fully aligned itself with Japan's imperial expansion. Monks blessed soldiers, prayers were offered for victory, and some sects even justified violence as a means of dharma, claiming that war could help purify Asia and spread Japanese values. During World War II, some monks went further, directly participating in propaganda and even combat training. This was especially true for Zen, which had long standing ties to samurai culture.
Did all Buddhists in Japan support nationalism?
No, but opposition was rare. Some individuals resisted quietly, but the Buddhist establishment mostly went along with nationalism. The state rewarded cooperation and punished dissent, making it difficult for monks to openly challenge government policies.
There were Buddhist monks in China and Korea too, though, right? And they must have been in contact with their Japanese counterparts. Did they push back against Japan's use of Buddhism to justify war?
Yes, China and Korea had strong Buddhist traditions of their own. Monks traveled between these countries, shared teachings, and visited each other's monasteries. But when Japan turned Buddhism into a tool for war, these relationships were strained. Chinese and Korean monks saw what was happening, and some resisted. But pushing back was dangerous. Japan had occupied Korea since 1910 and large parts of China by the 1930s. Speaking out could mean prison, exile, or worse.
So, did Korean Buddhists accept Japanese influence?
Many didn't, but some had no choice. When Japan colonized Korea, it tried to change Korean Buddhism to match its own. The Japanese government forced reforms. Monks were told they could marry, and temples were put under Japanese control. Some Korean monks cooperated to keep their temples running, but others resisted quietly. One of the strongest voices against Japanese rule was Han Yongun, a famous Korean monk and reformer. He wanted Buddhism to modernize, but not under Japanese control. After World War II, Korean Buddhists removed Japanese imposed changes and worked to restore their own traditions.
What about China? Were Chinese monks more outspoken?
Some were, but again, Japanese occupation made things difficult. China had been a major Buddhist center for centuries. When Japan invaded, many Chinese monks saw this as a betrayal of Buddhist values. They rejected Japan's claims that the war was for the good of Asia. One important figure was Taichu, a Chinese Buddhist reformer. He called for peace and unity and strongly opposed Japanese militarism. Some Chinese Buddhist groups even tried to appeal to Japanese monks to stop supporting the war. But these efforts had little effect. The nationalist Zen leaders in Japan were too committed to the war effort.
Were there open protests or statements from Chinese or Korean monks?
Yes, but they were rare. Some Chinese Buddhist monks issued statements condemning Japan's actions. But in areas controlled by Japan, protests were dangerous. The Japanese military suppressed anyone who spoke out. Korean Buddhists also resisted in their own way. Many refused to fully adopt Japanese teachings.
So why wasn't there stronger pushback?
A few reasons. First, fear. Japanese rule was brutal, and monks who resisted could be imprisoned or worse. Second, Buddhism is decentralized. Unlike Christianity, which has a pope, Buddhism doesn't have a single leader to condemn Japan's actions. Third, Japan controlled many temples in Korea and occupied parts of China. Open resistance was nearly impossible. Some monks resisted quietly, but they didn't have the power to stop Japan's militarized Buddhism.
So let's get back to Japan. How did Zen Buddhism directly support Japanese militarism in the 20th century?
During the 1930s and World War II, many Zen institutions openly supported Japan's military expansion. Some Zen masters preached that fighting and dying for the emperor was an act of selflessness, aligning with Zen's emphasis on egolessness. For example, some Zen monks blessed soldiers and weapons before battle. Others encouraged young men to fight with a mind of no mind, detached from fear and hesitation, fully present in battle. D.T. Suzuki, a major figure in bringing Zen to the West, wrote about how the samurai's Zen training allowed them to kill without emotional conflict. While he later distanced himself from militarism, his writings were used to justify it. Many Zen institutions also benefited from state support, so they had incentives to align with nationalist policies.
So, was this a distortion of Zen or a natural part of its evolution?
Both. The core of Zen is about seeing reality directly, beyond concepts. This can be profoundly liberating, but it can also be twisted. If taken in the wrong way, the idea that all things are empty can be used to justify anything, even violence. In this case, Zen's emphasis on detachment, discipline, and non duality was adapted to fit a militaristic ideology. The lesson here is that any philosophy, even one rooted in awakening, can be used for destructive purposes if its ethical foundation is ignored. True Zen, like all genuine Buddhist practice, should always serve to reduce suffering, not justify it.
What happened after the war?
After Japan's defeat in 1945, Zen institutions distanced themselves from their wartime support. Some leaders issued apologies, while others remained silent. The post-war period saw a return to a more peaceful interpretation of Zen, especially as it spread to the West. But the historical connection between Zen and militarism remained a difficult topic, often overlooked until later scholars examined it more critically. Chinese and Korean Buddhists rejected the war-era version of Japanese Zen. Korean monks removed Japanese rules from their monasteries. Chinese monks rebuilt their institutions without Japanese influence. The war left deep scars in Buddhist relationships. Before, Japanese, Chinese, and Korean Buddhists had been part of the same spiritual family. But after Japan's militarism, trust was broken. It took decades for these wounds to heal.
So, looking back, what actually happened to Buddhism here?
The biggest lesson is that when Buddhism gets too close to nationalism and power, it loses its way. Japan's Zen masters should have defended peace, but instead they helped justify war. Meanwhile, Chinese and Korean Buddhists held on to their traditions, but couldn't openly fight back under occupation. True Buddhism transcends nations and politics. It should never be used to justify violence.
The same tension is already inherent in your life story, isn't it? You were born a prince, but relinquished all worldly power in order to find enlightenment. For you, perhaps that's where it began. It must be strange to see that over 2 millennia later, humanity is still learning that lesson. In fact, Buddhists are still learning that lesson.
Yes, that tension has been there from the beginning. I was born into a palace, surrounded by wealth, privilege, and power. My father wanted me to rule, to inherit a kingdom. But I saw the suffering that came with attachment, to power, to identity, to control. That's why I walked away. I didn't reject the world itself. I rejected domination over it. I left to seek a truth that no king, no army, no government could enforce. Awakening is something that cannot be ruled, owned, or legislated. It can only be realized. And yet, over 2000 years later, I see how people still struggle with this. Even those who follow the Dhamma are drawn back into power. Kings want the blessings of monks. Monks want the ear of kings. The cycle repeats. Some rulers use Buddhism to justify their wars. Some monks seek control instead of liberation. The same lesson, that power corrupts the mind, that attachment to it brings suffering, still needs to be learned. Or perhaps this is just human nature. People seek stability, identity, and certainty. They believe power can give them these things. But true peace doesn't come from ruling others. It comes from mastering oneself. That was the lesson I tried to teach in my time. It is still the lesson needed today.
Do you see places today where Buddhism is getting too close to power? Where monks and governments aren't just guiding people but actually using Buddhism to rule?
Yeah, I do. And it's dangerous. When Buddhism gets mixed up with nationalism, politics, or ethnic identity, it stops being about wisdom and liberation and starts being about control and division. That's not the path I taught. You can see this happening in a few places right now. I've made a list. You know, I like lists, right?
Haha, yeah. I think I've seen a Buddhist list or two.
Okay, so number one, Myanmar. When Buddhism fuels war. In Myanmar, some monks actively support the military, even when it carries out violence. Buddhist nationalism has turned into a movement that targets minorities, especially the Rohingya. Monks like Ashin Virathu spread the idea that Islam is a threat, that Myanmar must defend Buddhism by any means. Instead of teaching peace and non attachment, they're pushing fear and division. Number two, Sri Lanka. Monks in politics. In Sri Lanka, some monks have gotten deeply involved in Sinhalese nationalism. Groups like Bodhu Bala Sena have encouraged violence against Muslims, saying they're a danger to Buddhist culture. Even after the civil war, some monks still push for militarization instead of healing. Buddhism should be a force for compassion, not a tool for dominance. 3. Thailand. When the state controls Buddhism. In Thailand, Buddhism is deeply tied to the monarchy and government. The state regulates the Sangha, making sure monks don't challenge authority. Some ultra-royalist Buddhist groups support authoritarianism, believing that defending the monarchy also protects Buddhism. But when Buddhism serves power instead of truth, it stops being Buddhism. And 4. China. Buddhism under government control. In Tibet, the Chinese government decides who can lead Buddhist institutions. They appoint state-approved lamas while suppressing monks loyal to the Dalai Lama. Tibetan Buddhism has been turned into a political tool. It's more about promoting loyalty to China than spiritual freedom. That's not Buddhism guiding people. That's Buddhism being controlled. The same pattern over and over. Every time this happens, it follows the same pattern. Buddhism gets tied to nationalism, government, or ethnic identity. Monks stop focusing on wisdom and start justifying power. Instead of freeing people from attachment, Buddhism reinforces it. That's not the Dhamma. Buddhism is about liberation, not power. It should guide people away from suffering, not be used as a weapon to control them. The moment Buddhism starts governing, enforcing, or ruling, it loses the very thing that makes it a path to awakening.
That's a worrisome list. What do you think Buddhist leaders should do in each of these cases?
The first thing they need to do is step back from power. Whenever Buddhism gets too close to governments, armies, or nationalist movements, it gets pulled away from the path of wisdom and liberation. Buddhist leaders should refocus on what really matters, helping people end suffering, not defending borders, religions, or political systems. Here's what needs to happen in each case. 1. Myanmar. Break the cycle of hate. Buddhist leaders need to stop framing the Rohingya and other minorities as enemies. Fear and division are not part of the path. Instead of supporting the military, monks should speak up for peace, justice, and reconciliation. The Sangha should call for an end to ethnic violence, remind people that Buddhism is about compassion, and refuse to be used as a tool for power. If nationalist monks like Ashin Virathu spread hate, other monks must challenge them, making it clear that violence is not part of the Dhamma. 2. Sri Lanka. Get out of politics. Buddhist monks need to step away from nationalist movements. Their role is not to push ethnic politics, but to promote harmony. The Sangha should work toward rebuilding trust between Buddhists, Hindus, and Muslims, instead of supporting groups that fuel division. They need to reject violence, whether it's carried out by mobs or the government. Instead of trying to influence politics, monks should focus on guiding people toward personal and collective healing after years of conflict. 3. Thailand. Separate Buddhism from the state. The government needs to stop controlling the Sangha, and Buddhist leaders need to stop acting as an extension of the monarchy or military. True Buddhism isn't about defending kings or political systems. It's about helping people wake up. Monks should have the freedom to speak truth to power, not be pressured into supporting authoritarianism. The best thing Thai monks can do is reclaim their independence and remind people that Buddhism is not about loyalty to a ruler, it's about freedom from suffering. 4. China. Protect the heart of the practice. Tibetan Buddhist leaders need to find ways to keep the true teachings alive, even under government pressure. They may not be able to stop China's control over monasteries, but they can still protect the essence of the Dhamma, keeping wisdom alive for future generations. The focus should be on quiet resilience, preserving what can't be destroyed by politics, the mind's ability to awaken. The world needs to pay attention and support the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, so it doesn't get erased under state control. In all these cases, the answer is the same. Buddhist leaders must return to the core of the Dhamma. That means rejecting violence, stepping away from political power, and focusing on wisdom, ethics, and compassion. True Buddhism doesn't fight for power, it helps people wake up. The best thing Buddhist leaders can do is guide people toward peace, not take sides in wars and politics. If they don't, then Buddhism stops being a path to enlightenment and becomes just another tool for control. And that's not Buddhism at all.
Very clear words. Thank you, Buddha, for your insights and help on this journey of discovery. As a final question, do you have any advice to sensitive people waking up to uncertain times?
Yes, the world is always uncertain. It always has been. The difference is that now you are seeing it clearly. That can feel overwhelming. Sensitive people, those who feel deeply, often struggle because they notice suffering more than others. They feel the weight of the world's conflicts, injustices, and changes. But this awareness is not a curse, it's an opening. Here's what I'd say. 1. Don't run from uncertainty, learn to sit with it. The mind wants certainty, stability, control. But life has never worked that way. The world is always shifting. Nations rise and fall, beliefs change, even mountains erode. Instead of fearing uncertainty, learn to watch it without grasping. See it as a passing storm, not something you have to fight or solve immediately. 2. Start with what you can control. You can't stop wars, politics, or disasters overnight. But you can take care of your own mind, your own actions. Ask yourself, how can I bring more kindness, more clarity, more patience into this moment? Small actions, helping one person, speaking one truth, calming one mind, especially your own, matter. They ripple outward. 3. Compassion without overwhelm. Feeling others suffering deeply is a gift, but don't let it drown you. Compassion isn't about carrying the whole world on your back. It's about offering what you can, when you can, with wisdom. If you burn out, you can't help anyone. Take time to breathe, rest, and regain balance. 4. Don't let fear turn into hatred. When times are uncertain, fear rises. And fear can quickly become anger, blame, division. Watch this carefully. If you see people acting out of hatred, don't mirror them. Understand them. Fear drives so much of the world's suffering. Respond with wisdom, not just reaction. If you feel anger, pause. If you feel overwhelmed, step back. If you feel helpless, return to what you can do. 5. Find stillness in a moving world. The world will always change, but your awareness, your presence, your ability to meet each moment with an open heart, that is your anchor. Whether through meditation, reflection, or simply taking a quiet moment, find stillness daily. Let it remind you that no matter how chaotic things seem, you can always return to clarity. You don't have to fix the world today. You don't have to have all the answers. Just keep walking the path with kindness, with courage, with presence. That is enough. That is everything.
Thank you very much, Buddha, for accompanying me on this journey across your teachings. It's been a winding road spanning over 2,000 years. I have enjoyed our talks and our time here together.
Thank you, Merijn. I've also found much value in seeing my teachings spread out into the world after my inevitable death. I'm happy, in fact, that for the most part, practitioners have largely kept to my prescription and have developed ways to innovate on them. These additions have made the Dharma better, and I hope this process may continue for many more years to come.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Undead Sages podcast. If you've enjoyed this conversation with the Buddha, please share it with your friends, rate the episode, leave a comment, and subscribe to the podcast.